Good afternoon, everyone, and thanks to the organizers for having me here, and it's great to be part of this conversation. I think I gave an abstract, but I'm going to kind of veer away from what I had said because of the conversation we've had so far, and to kind of ground Sri Lanka in a kind of a historical moment. In the 1920s, in Jaffna, perhaps the first truly anti-colonial movement in Sri Lanka was called the Jaffna Youth Congress. It was initially called the Jaffna Students' Congress, which became the Jaffna Youth Congress. And the Jaffna Youth Congress consisted of mainly students and teachers, young teachers from Jaffna at that time. And they had an idea of a anti-colonial politics that included the entire island. So while they were mainly Tamil, they also brought many Sinhala activists from the south, political activists, political leaders from the south. And they had this politics of the anti-colonial politics was about indigenization, particularly giving importance to Tamil and Tamil literature and the national languages. But they also had a very strong anti-caste orientation, where Jaffna society was, very much stratified by caste. They started a movement of equal seating, equal eating among the caste communities. And they went, further. These were, very young guys in their 20s who then went ahead and invited Gandhi, and actually Gandhi ended up visiting Sri Lanka and Jaffna on their invitation in 1927. So they were very much also influenced by the Indian national movement for liberation. So this movement, possibly the first anti-colonial movement and definitely the first major kind of Tamil social political movement, even though it spread quite widely, in 1931, in the face of kind of the British giving some amount of autonomy, they decided to boycott the election because they wanted full suffrage. And in the process, it was a path not taken into the political process. And then that's also the beginning of the Tamil and Sinhala elite and the Tamil nationalists and the Sinhala nationalists gaining a foothold through the political process. But many of them who belonged to the Jaffna Youth Congress eventually became some of the leading educationists. Many of them were part of the initiation of the cooperative movement in Sri Lanka, and many of them also ended up with the left movement, but they never had the kind of the limelight that they had in the 1920s and early 30s. But I come back to this also because, I think what we were talking earlier about the crisis that we are facing in South Asia, and very much so in Sri Lanka and definitely in northern Sri Lanka after the war, is to think about the paths not taken, right? But this sort of path has remained as dissent, I would argue, within the Tamil political tradition, and how do we recover that? And many of them, I should also mention that they became part of the major anti-caste movement in Jaffna and northern Sri Lanka in the 1960s. Arguably, the first kind of armed struggle within the Tamil community was along caste lines. About 15, 20 people died in trying to get access to temples. So the temple entry movement of the oppressed caste, equal seating in tea shops and so on in the 1960s, which was a major blow to untouchability within the Tamil community in the north. But with the rise of kind of Tamil nationalism and the separatist movement, this kind of anti-caste politics was very much suppressed. And in the last decade or so, there is very much a silence about talking about caste in northern Sri Lanka. So I kind of give this historical kind of backdrop, and then I kind of want to fast forward to the last 3 years in terms of, maybe not only in Sri Lanka, but in many parts of the world, what we are talking about, this sudden kind of resurgence of authoritarian nationalism or authoritarian populism, what we are seeing with Modi in India, Trump in the US, Putin. I mean, this kind of the global kind of politics of this and its emergence, and it's kind of also, I think, in many places framed around the kind of crisis of neoliberalism, or a response to neoliberalism from the far right, and how do we understand it. But in the Sri Lankan context, and particularly northern Sri Lanka, I would argue it's a kind of a historical anomaly which makes it interesting, right? In the sense that in the case of certainly northern Sri Lanka, even though Sri Lanka was the first country to take forward neoliberal policies as early as 1977, well before Reagan and Thatcher came on the scene, when Jayawardena put forward his open economy policies. But in terms of northern Sri Lanka, because of the civil war, we were isolated from the market. And it was very much a consolidation of a nationalist politics that ran its course for a few decades. And when the war ended, it was the kind of brutal authoritarianism and militarization of the Rajapaksa regime that remained, even though they started to open up the market and bring about the neoliberal reforms even to the north. So what I mean by an historical anomaly is almost that we had decades of authoritarian nationalism, and then we kind of had to face the neoliberal market from which the north was isolated for decades. And what does that and what are the political dynamics on the ground when you have that kind of a situation? Because I think in some ways we think that, okay, now we have this this authoritarian populist or nationalist kind of forces, the right emerging, and then after that collapse, maybe there's potential for the left. And what does the left do? I mean, that's part of some of the conversations that the left is having. But in reality, what happens when these authoritarian regimes collapse? What happens to that democratic space? And that's what I want to kind of explore with you in thinking through what's going on in northern Sri Lanka. So when the Rajapaksa regime was thrown out of power in 2015, democratically thrown out by both a large section of the Sinhala population as well as the Tamil and Muslim minorities coming together in this major regime change, which very few people expected or predicted, where they were talking about the Rajapaksas going to be there, creating a dynasty and so on. When that happened in northern Sri Lanka, there was definitely, for the first time, a major opening of democratic space. And even for someone like me as a researcher, it was like night and day. In 2014, when I'd go to Kilnochia, Mullaitivu, the kind of war-torn districts in the north to do some research, to interview, and even if I just go to one house, definitely within an hour, there'll be a intelligence guy coming there to ask what's going on, who is this, who are you talking to, those kinds of questions. A year later, a year and a half later, suddenly you see people protesting out on the streets, issues around land, on fishing rights, so many different protests. So it was like night and day in terms of the opening of democratic space. And then, so of course, we were also expecting these struggles to emerge, and I would argue that those struggles in the southern parts of the country had started to emerge even in 2013-14, which is what led to the fall of the Rajapaksas. But what form did those struggles take? So, for example, there was large swaths of military-occupied land in the north, which after the war, the military decided to hold on to. And so a lot of the struggles were people camping out in front of that land and trying to regain those private lands. There were families of the disappeared who were starting to protest, right, asking questions about what happened to their disappeared relatives. There was, but the neoliberal reforms had also taken up and were moving forward. The kind of market economy was being brought forward even during the Rajapaksa time after the war, and that continued after this regime change. So then we started to see massive levels of indebtedness, particularly women being targeted by microfinance companies, where even suicide attempts and some suicides as well, with this huge level of indebtedness among the war-torn population. Fisheries was another conflict that we had, particularly in the north with Tamil Nadu, where trawlers from Tamil Nadu were coming and poaching in the waters, and they used these bottom trawlers that ravage the seas. They cut through the nets of our much smaller fishermen. Again, the fishermen in northern Sri Lanka start to organize in major ways. But what, in looking at these struggles, what struck out was that, of course, as organizers and activists were looking at, okay, where are these struggles moving? And of course, they were coming up in all places, but they remained fractured and dispersed. They remained issue-based. So, and this is a problem. And not only that, so if it struggles for land, it was always about getting that piece of private land back from the military, and it was a negotiation with the state. The issue of thousands of people who are landless never comes into the land struggle. If it's the question of the disappeared, it's about raising certain issues. Much of it even got diverted towards raising it in Geneva and so on. But the fact that when somebody's disappeared, the main income earner in that family is no longer there, that family is in really bad shape, economically unable to feed themselves, that never comes up. So there were these very clear limitations to these struggles as well, and that's posed a lot of questions. And even if you take this widespread indebtedness, almost every village that we go to do research, there is high levels of indebtedness, and these microfinance companies basically use thugs who go and intimidate the women to recover the loans. While there'll be other mobilizations, again here, people won't be defiant. They would somehow manage to, and if you look at recovery rates from these microfinance loans, which the interest rates are on the order of 40% to 220% effective annual interest rates, and these are formal institutions, right? But the resistance is lacking. Maybe some petitions through some women's groups and so on. So why this predicament? So the democratic space is there, the struggles are emerging, but they are kind of carved out in certain ways. And as I mentioned, many of them were issue-based. They were very local. You couldn't scale up. And they were not transformational in any sense, nor were they kind of autonomous. They were all about negotiating with the state, right? What can we get from the state? So it inevitably, so there wasn't that autonomy to it. So this raises a number of questions, and I think one thing that I want to think about, I think people have talked about kind of political subjectivity and so on. I'm looking at it mainly in terms of, where are the sites of struggle, and what are the social institutions where those struggles happen. In the South, as I mentioned, even before Rajapaksa's fall, we could see the kind of dispersed, in many ways, there may not have been some coherence, but the kind of struggles that were emerging mainly by trade unions. That was the kind of signal of possibly regime change. In the North, trade unions were decimated during the war, but the North has a long history of cooperatives, and the cooperatives survived the war, and they become an important site, but then the cooperatives had become very apolitical. They had become institutions where people are part of, but they didn't have the political edge. I mean, arguably cooperatives are never that militant, but in this context of, the problem for me is that even though the democratic space opened up, the two kind of dominant visions, one of nationalism remained. Even though the war was over, Tamil nationalism in the north and Sinhala Buddhist nationalism in the south remained very powerful forces. And that is what defined the kind of political vision of some of these struggles, whether it's the families of the disappeared, of the landless, or the land struggles. It's all about, is the military holding your land and how do you get it back? But those who are economically marginalized as historically landless because of caste and so on doesn't come into the picture. The other is the kind of the neoliberal mindset that very quickly seeped in. You took a loan, it's your problem. You had the choice to take the loan, now you better pay it back. So that kind of thinking was also entrenched. And in that context, the cooperatives were an institution that questions the market, right? And it's also it's an institution of obviously collective production, but also a structure that is in some ways, of course, is related to the market, but only partially related to the market, that gives some space. But as I mentioned, the cooperatives had become very apolitical. There is caste within cooperatives, the caste hierarchies. The other aspects of our social structure are very much there if you take something like the cooperative space. And this is where, one of the more interesting things that happened over the last 2 years is, as I mentioned, for almost 4 decades, there's a complete silence on the discussion of caste in northern Sri Lanka. The LTT, the Tigers, put a lid on it. They said there should be only one struggle, which is this ethno-nationalist struggle, so we won't talk about caste. And then even afterwards, the kind of Tamil nationalist discourse has been to completely disregard caste as an issue. And in the last 2 years, there have been kind of caste struggles that have emerged in a major way. And that, I think, has a political edge, even within the cooperatives. There are toddy tappers cooperatives, caste-based occupations like fisheries and so on, which are marginalized by Tamil politics, that those are also emerging. So this, and similarly, maybe not as militant around issues like indebtedness, the women's rights movement is also getting much more engaged in these struggles, and that, so both caste and the women's rights movement, working both within the cooperatives and so on, poses certain contradictions for both the nationalist view of politics as well as the kind of neoliberal trajectory within which we are caught in. So to kind of sum up, what should solidarity look like in these kinds of contexts? One, I think, argument I would make is that both, historically in Sri Lanka and to this day, Tamil nationalism and Sinhala Buddhist nationalism reinforce each other. I always think of them as objective allies in the kind of public sphere, right? In the public opinion making, in the media, and so if you read the Tamil media and the Sinhala media, they are almost the mirror in terms of reinforcing Tamil nationalism and Sinhala Buddhist nationalism. And then the public opinion makers, for them, nationalism becomes the vehicle, which raises questions to me. And there's a debate going on, as I mentioned, the anti-caste struggles in the 1960s, those from the Jaffna Youth Congress, and particularly the Communist Party took the lead there, particularly the Maoist communist wing of the Communist Party. So there's continuing to be debates for us locally within the North, and I've been part of that debate. Is there a progressive content to nationalism in our age now, in this kind of neoliberal post-colonial age? Is there a progressive content, or how do we think about nationalism? And that's, I think, a question we can think about more generally for South Asia. And then, how do you build these kinds of alliances between the communities? But more importantly, I think paying more attention to the rural-urban divide, and that's where neoliberalism in particular, and I think much of our analysis has been so much more focused on financialization and the city and the urban spaces that the rural. And if you look at Sri Lanka historically, and if you are following Sri Lanka the last 2 months, there's been a resurgence of Rajapaksa, and who threw out Rajapaksa 3 years ago was also the rural constituency, and who's probably strengthening Rajapaksa now, also the rural constituency. And I think that's a link between neoliberalism as well. So I think the larger argument I want to make is, in this kind of a crisis-prone situation that we are in, what are the sites for struggle, and how do we, make those spaces more radical in terms of having the potential for changing social relations or the social structures in a way. Because even if you take trade unions or cooperatives, these so-called progressive spaces, even within them, how do you radicalize them on issues of gender, on caste, on ethnic coexistence, and so on, which is the major challenge. Thank you.